Hey everyone, and welcome back to the React series for beginners. In this episode, we're going to go over how to render lists in React and how to also deal with conditional rendering in React. Rendering lists refers to being able to render something that has multiple pieces of data in it, like an array or an object. Conditional rendering means being able to selectively choose what is displayed based on some conditions, kind of like an if statement from typical coding. So we'll start first with rendering lists. To get into list rendering, let's first make a new component that we can render. Let's go into our source folder here and click New File. And let's make a new file just for now. Let's just call it textblock.jsx like this. And then inside, just like any other React component, let's write export function textblock, parentheses here for any props we want to add in. And then we'll do this. And then obviously, since it's a React component, we want to return JSX. Let's do the return statement here. And then for now, let's just do an empty tag. And then inside of this, I'm going to make a button. And then inside of this button, all I want to do for right now is just say hello. So basically just made a little text block component that just has an empty button inside of it. If we go ahead and save this, we now go to our app.jsx file and you wanted to render this new text block component we just made. We could just go up top here. We could just go ahead and import it. Let's say import text block like this. And then we could just type it like this here, just as we render any other component. Then we can go ahead and save this. And now you can see we have a button that says hello because this is our text block component. If we wanted to render more of these, we could just copy and paste this a bunch of times, right? If I wanted 2 of them, I could just do this. If I wanted 3 of them, I could just do this, and so forth. But what if we wanted to render 100 of these? It's not efficient to have to type a component out every single time we want to render it. And it's not dynamic either, since it's statically coded into the page. And this is where list rendering comes in. To render multiple of something, we can use a super helpful function called map, which basically just maps every element in some array to some JSX code. Because we're going to use the map function, we're going to need to make an array first. So up here in our actual app component, let's make a new array. I'm just going to write const, let's name it myArray, and then we're going to do a constructor function for our array and say array5.fill equals true. So all this line is basically doing here is making a new variable called myArray, and then we're creating a new array using this new array constructor with JavaScript. We're specifying 5 because we want 5 total elements in our array, which means our array will be 5 elements long. And then for now, we're just filling every single array element with the value true. So all this basis line basically does is makes an array that looks something like this. It would just be like true, 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 and it looks something like that. Now, because we have an array of 5 elements, we can now render any tag or component 5 times if we use this array. Let me show you how to do this using the map function. So we can actually call the map function inside of our component return, meaning we're passing it inside where we would normally put JSX code, which would be in here. But the map function is going to call JavaScript, so I want to use curly brackets to specify our code that we're going to write some JavaScript. So let's go ahead and just delete these here. And then let's put in some curly brackets here, just so we know we're going to use JavaScript. To use the map function, you're going to call it on an array or object. So to do that, we can just access the array we made. It's called myArray. And then we can type .map just like this. And then similar to how we work with other JavaScript functions, we're going to pass in an arrow function inside this map function here. And I'll explain how it works. So I'll make parentheses here right now. And for right now, we don't actually need any arguments. But I'm just going to do the arrow and then do our curly brackets like this. So now you should have a map function that looks something like this. Now let's review what we're trying to do with this map function. We want to use this array of 5 elements to display 5 text block components. So how do we actually do that? Well, within a map function, if we want to map every element to some component like we're trying to do, we need to have the map function return JSX for each element. So to do that, inside of here, we need to actually write a return statement so that every single element returns some sort of JSX. And then inside of our return statement, let's just go ahead and specify the text block component we made earlier, like this. This is just specifying that for every element, we're returning a JSX component. In our case, we are returning this text block component that we just made. So in summary, we're calling a map function on our array of 5 elements. Inside this map function here, we need to pass in a function that specifies what to do with each element. All our function is doing is returning this text block component. There are 5 elements in our array up here that we made because we filled it with 5. So therefore, all this is doing is just going to render 5 text blocks. And we can actually see that if we go ahead and save this code here, you can now see that we have 5 text blocks. This method of making an array and just filling it works well if you're trying to work with a fixed number of components that you want and don't want to type every component render out. And the great thing about doing it this way is that we could just change this number up here that we have if I wanted to specify how many blocks we actually run a render. So instead of 5, let's say I want to do 25. Save that. Now we have 25 text blocks here. Instead of 25, let me just go ahead and put 225. Save it, and now we have 225 text blocks here. So if we know beforehand that we want to code a fixed number of elements into a list, we can use this method here of just making an array, filling it with that number of elements, and then using the map function to actually just return whatever component wanted to return. However, really quickly, let's check out one small issue we have with our code. If we go ahead and just inspect this and open up our console here, and then head to our console here, you'll see that we have this warning here that says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. With React, anytime you're doing list rendering, it's standard practice to make a unique key for each element that you're rendering. So basically, the React program wants to see every item rendered has a unique ID that can be used to identify it. The program will never cause any error from this, but it'll always give you a warning if you don't do this. Now, I know I shouldn't, but for right now, I'm actually going to ignore this warning, and I'll show you how to correct it in the next example that we use. So for our very next example, I want to combine what we've learned about props to fill in with what we just learned about using the map function. So let's take a look at our text blocks component here. Right now, we don't have any actual props in it. So text block, we don't have any actual props that we're passing in right here, and we're just statically coding this hello right inside the button tag here. Now, instead of just statically coding this prop inside here, I actually want to instead be able to customize what every single button says in a list rendering type of way. So I'm going to make a prop using destructuring. So I'm going to add curly brackets here, and I'm just going to call it text for right now. And then instead of passing in hello right here, I'm just going to go ahead and pass in this text prop that we just made. This now allows us to pass in a text prop to every text block that we render, and that text will then be displayed inside of this button tag instead of just the word hello. So now let's go ahead and save this, and let's go ahead and go back into our app here. And right now we just have 225 empty buttons because we're not passing any props, therefore the text is empty on all these. And we're using this array obviously just to fill in those 225 elements. Instead of doing a filler array, actually, I'm going to go ahead and just delete this here. And I'm going to make a new array with just a couple of strings in it. So inside this array here, I'm going to make an array of a couple of animals here. We'll just say dog, cat, horse, mouse, and fox, just like this. So now this myArray variable is 5 elements, where each element is its own unique string. And now whenever we render our buttons, we want to actually access the contents of our array. So let's make an argument inside of our arrow function down here, inside of our map. So I'm just going to call this argument element for right now. Let's just add it to our arrow function here, because it'll represent each individual element of our array. So what do we want to do now? Well, if we go ahead and just go ahead and save this, and then we go back into our text block component, we can see that we've made this text prop that we're passing into the actual text field. So each time we render a text block, we should now pass in a text prop into it. So what we want to do now is make a new prop on this text block render here that we call text. And then what are we going to set it equal to? Well, all this map is doing here is basically creating an element for each mapping of the array, or basically for each element of the array. So for our text argument here, we can just go ahead and plug in element like this. So basically what this is doing is that at the first iteration of this mapping, element is equal to dog. The next iteration, it is equal to cat. Next iteration is equal to horse, and so forth, because it just goes in order of our array. A map function, a way to think about it, is basically kind of like a for loop in a sense. If we go ahead and save this page here, and now we look at our site, we now have 5 text blocks, each with their own unique value, each representing one item in the array we made, because we use this map function down here to map each of them to their own text block. And now that we have this set up, I'm going to go ahead and revisit that warning I was telling you about just a moment ago. So I'm going to refresh this page here, and I'm going to reopen our console, and you can see that we're still getting this warning about each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So sometimes when you're working with an array of objects, each object may have some sort of ID for that object that you could easily plug in as a key. But since we're using just an array of strings right now, we don't actually really have that. We don't have some sort of ID to really work with here. So to get around this, inside of our map function, I'm actually going to make a second argument here next to element that I'm just going to call index. By default, when you make arguments in a map like this, the first argument that you can name whatever, we named the element, the first argument always represents the actual items in the array, and the second argument will actually represent the index of each item in the array. So for instance, on the first iteration of the mapping, element is equal to dog, index is equal to 0. On the next iteration, element is equal to cat, index is equal to 1, and hopefully you get the picture. To silence this warning for now, what we can do is just pass in the index of each element, because it'll be unique to each element since there's only one index per element. To do that, let's go into our text blocks render here, and then let's just go ahead and specify key like this, and then we just want to pass in the index. So key isn't an actual prop that we have inside of our component, but key is recognized by React as a keyword. Anytime you're rendering lists or arrays like this in React, you're usually always going to want to have a key tag in whatever it is you're rendering, and put something that is unique like the index. So if we go ahead and save this, and then refresh our page here, open up our console, you can see that we no longer have this warning, and it's no longer giving us a problem. Now that we've got this figured out with the array rendering, the next thing I want to show you is how we can render an array of objects instead of just an array of strings or numbers. The same principles apply to rendering an array of objects because we're still using an array and the map function, but we'll add a bit more to what we're rendering. So to look at this, let's envision a new scenario we want for our React app. Let's say we have an online store, and our store contains 3 items that people can look at and purchase. Each of these 3 items has a title, a description, and a price on it. To reflect these properties, let's make a new component. So let's go into here, let's make a new file, and let's just go ahead and make a new component. I'm going to call it storeitem.jsx. And then to make our component, we're just going to write export function store item, make our parentheses for our props here, and then we'll do the curly brackets. And then, like always, in a React component, we want to return JSX. Let's do a return statement. And then for now, we're just going to do empty tags like this. And then for our store item, we're going to want 3 props for each of our items. So let's go ahead and go in here. Let's specify curly brackets, and then let's specify the props that we want. So let's think about this. For items, we're going to want, let's say, for each one, a title. We're going to want a description, which will just say a desk. And then we'll also want a price for the item. And those will be the 3 things that set each item apart from each other. And then inside of our return for our component here, let's make a tag for each one of our props. So we'll just do, let's say, an h1 tag. And for this, we're going to pass in a title prop. And then for description, let's do a p tag for this one. And then for that, we will just say desk for description. And then for price, let's do a button for price because normally price buttons are clickable. So we'll do a button like this, and then we will just pass in price as so. And for right now, this styling isn't going to look super good because we're not actually doing any custom CSS right now, but hopefully you get the picture of what we're doing here. We're just making a tag for each one of our props. Now, anytime we render any of this store item component that we have, we're going to want to pass in each of these 3 props that we've just made so we can fill in all of these tags down here. So for now, let's go ahead and save this, and let's go back to our app.jsx component now. And now we'll just create some sample items for our store as objects. So I'm actually going to delete this here. Let's make a object. I'm going to say const item1 equals title. We're just passing as bat. Let's pretend we're doing some like baseball equipment, right? We'll have bat. We'll say description, metal bat for baseball. And then we'll have another property that says price is equal to 50. And then let's say we want to have, let's say 3 items here. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. We're going to paste it twice. And then let's just rename these here. So we'll have item 2, and then we will have item 3. For title for item 2, let's just go ahead and say ball like this. And then for description, let's just write standard baseball. And then for this third one, let's do title helmet. And then we're just going to do description, baseball, helmet. And then for prices, let's just say item 2, we'll do 5. And then item 3, we will do 25 like this. And let's now just go ahead and just save it. And then now instead of making an array of just a few strings like this, let's actually make our array full of these objects that we just made. So I'm just going to cut this and just paste it below our objects here. Make some room up here. And then let's replace these array elements with the objects instead that we just made. So inside of here, let's pass in item 1, let's pass in item 2, and then let's pass in item 3. Now what we've essentially done is created an array filled with 3 objects. Now let's look at actually rendering out a store item component for each one of these array elements. We have our map function already in place, and our element and index already defined as our arguments down here inside of our map. Because we're now dealing with objects, this element right here, this element argument, is going to be equal to an object at each iteration of this mapping. So for example, on the first item, element will be equal to item 1, On the next iteration, element will be equal to item 2, and then on the last iteration, element will be equal to item 3. So then let's look at our component that we're actually rendering down here. Let's go ahead and delete text block for now since we're done using that. And now let's render a store item component that we just made. Let's render store item just like this. And then we want to pass in a title, description, and price for each one of these store items, because that's what we defined as our 3 props inside of here. So looking at this, how are we going to do this? Well, we can just pass in the title, description, and price just like we would any other props. The only difference now is this time we'll need to reference the properties of our element object. So to make our props, let me show you. To make a title prop, to pass in, we want to do title, and then all we want to do is access element.title, because again, this element right here is representing each individual object in our array. And then we want to do the same now for description and price. So let's do desk for description. That will be equal to element.desk, and then price will be equal to element.price, just like this. And then just so we don't get any warning, I'm actually going to go ahead and make a key tag and make it equal to our index, just like last time. Just like this. And now we are successfully rendering them. All we're doing here is basically the same thing as before, except now we have an array full of objects instead of an array of strings. For each element in the array, we're just returning one of the store item components, and we're just passing in 3 props to each store item, which represent the properties that, again, we made in our component here, which, of course, we named title, desk, price. So we want to make sure that those match exactly in here. So we have title here, we have desk here, and then we have price. And then for each of these props, we are just passing in the object itself, and then each of its properties. If we go ahead and just save this now, it should display, actually our page is blank. Let me look at store item not defined. Oh, okay. So we forgot to import our store item. So let's go in here, make sure we import store item here. Let's try again. Let's save it now. And now it actually works. So now you can see we have 3 store items on our page, 1 for each of the objects. And each object has props for title, description, and price. Now clearly it's not formatted super nice since we haven't added any custom CSS, but you can clearly see that we have 3 distinct components here. Component 1, component 2, and then component 3. And let's make a quick upgrade to this component real quick. It's kind of inconvenient to have to type out every single prop like this individually. So right here we're typing out title, then we're typing out description, and then we're typing out price as well. So it's kind of inconvenient to actually do that. So instead of doing that, let's just pass in one object prop that represents the entire object. And then inside the component, we will specify the individual fields. So to do that, let's just go ahead and take these here. Everything from price over. Let's just go ahead and delete that. So let's delete all this stuff. And then I'm going to make a new prop and just call it item. And then all I'm going to do here is simply just pass in the element, because this element is already representing our actual object. So let's go ahead and save this here. And then let's go into our store item component. And now we want to remove these 3 props and make them just one called item. So let's remove these. Let's make it just called item like this. And then for our fields, we need to specify item dot whatever. So item dot title, we're going to do item dot desk for description, and then item dot price like this. And now if we go ahead and save this here, it looks the exact same. And just so we're clear on this, let's look at this a little more. So again, we have this item prop here, and we're just doing item.title, item.desk, and item.price. Why does this work? Well, if we go into our app.jsx here, you can see that for our item prop, we are just passing an element. Well, each element is equal to each one of these objects in our array. So for example, on the first run of the map, element is item 1, and then it's item 2, and then it's item 3. And each of these has 3 properties: title, desk, and price. Hence why in our actual component here, we can do item.title, item.desk, and item.price. So it's actually a bit more writing in this component since we're just kind of adding these item dots in front of them. But it saves us quite a bit of writing in this component, so that we don't actually have to pass in every single prop individually. We can just pass in kind of a big object for this. Anytime you have an array of things in React, whether it be an array of objects like we have here, or like an array of numbers or strings like we had before, whatever it may be, the way to render out multiple pieces of JSX based on that array is the map function. This map function is extremely commonly used, and you should try and get very comfortable with it because it has a lot of use cases and is one of the more common functions that you're going to see in React. Now that we've learned this map function and how to use it to render multiple things, the next thing we should look at is something called conditional rendering. Conditional rendering is when we choose what to render based on some condition. Think of it like an if statement before we act. If some condition is true, we display some component. If the condition is false, we display a different component. There's a lot of use cases for something like conditional rendering. Like for example, if somebody clicks a button and after it gets clicked, we need to display some other component like a drop-down menu, for instance. To set up a new scenario, let's actually go back into our button component that we made in one of the first episodes. So I want to now change what this button does. Instead of just incrementing some counting variable from our state, I instead want to use this button to open up a menu. When this button is clicked, I want one of our store item components to pop up. So it's basically like a show item button. So if it's clicked for the first time, it'll show it, and then if it's clicked again, it'll hide it, and that process could repeat forever. So because I want to completely revamp this button, let's actually wipe out all this old code we have from our last episodes. So we'll go ahead and just completely clear it out. And then I actually want to make a piece of state that's going to be a Boolean value that we can use to turn the button on and off. So let's go ahead and write a new piece of state here. Let's just call it, let's say show, and then we'll say set show. And then we want it to be Boolean. Let's make it false by default, so that should be the starting value. This way we're making a new state variable called show, and we're setting it to false. And then in our onClick event here, instead of messing with setCount, we don't have that function anymore. So let's change this to setShow here. And then let's go ahead and just delete this count plus one that we have going on for right now. Now the question is, how should we set our show variable once this button is clicked? Well, we should set it equal to the opposite of whatever it currently is, if it's Boolean. So if the show is currently true, when clicked, it should change to false. And then if it's currently false and it's clicked, it should change to true. And then that keeps going on forever and ever. So to do that, we can just actually write exclamation point show like this. As we know, exclamation point is the not operator, meaning for Booleans, it'll be the opposite of what it currently is. So for example, if show is true, then not show is equal to false. Hence why this should work if we're using it to set it to opposite of the current value that it is. Now we should go ahead and change the text that our button is displaying based on what the value of show currently is. If show is true, that means that it is already showing, so the button should say hide item, so that users know if they click again, the item will hide. If show is equal to false, then the button should say show item, so users know they could click it and show it. One way we could do this would be with the ternary operator that most languages have, and we can do that inside of our JSX. To do that inside of our p tag, we would just use curly brackets, which we already have, and then we could write an if statement using the ternary operator, which, if you're not familiar with it, is basically an if-else statement using a question mark and a colon for syntax. To show you how to use it, let's go ahead and write it. So I'm just going to write show equals true like this, and then if it's true, we want to display hide item. So we're going to use a question mark, and then we're going to say hide item, and then to denote when the condition is true. And then if it's not true, meaning our else statement, we use colon to denote it. So I'll write colon, and if that's the case, we just want to write show item, and that reflects what we just went over. All this entire line is saying is that if show is true, then you want to display hide item. Otherwise, if it's not true, we're just going to display show item. And real quick, just because we're getting a little bit of overflow here, I'm going to make this a little bit wider, so it's a little easier to see and make our actual site a little bit narrower. And let's go ahead and just save this file. And now if we go back into our app.jsx file real quick, let's delete all the stuff with the mapping for our list rendering for right now. So let's just go ahead and let's just delete this. And then for now, let's just render a singular button in here. So let's just call the render component here. And then if we just go ahead and save the page here, and actually just so we're not mapping, I'm actually going to delete all of this here and just render a button by itself. Just do it like this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this array here. And I'm going to go ahead and just keep the items for now because I might use them in just a second. But I'll go ahead and just save this. And now we have a button on our page that defaults to saying show item. Then if we click it, it goes to hide item because our onClick was triggered. So let's go back to our button real quick here. Just to review that, we have our show state here. And then our onClick is just setting the show equal to the opposite of what it currently is. So if it is true, that means we will be showing hide item. And then we click it, and then it is set to show item because we're using this if conditional statement here basically, where it's basically saying if show is true, then we're going to display hide item. If it is false, we are going to display show item. But if we're going to use this button here to display one of our store items, then showing the text on this button is only part of the problem. Ideally, we would use this show button to actually show something on our screen and not just change the text within itself. So let's actually combine everything we've learned so far about components, props, state, and now conditional rendering to make this. So for our scenario, we want this button to display a store item component whenever it is clicked. Inside of our app.jsx file, we should check if this button is clicked or not, and if it is, we should display store item. But in our case, this app component here would be our parent component, and then the button component along with a store item component would be like sibling components. So the real question is, how would we communicate between the button and the store item? The answer to that question is by using props to pass down information from our parent component, which is app.jsx, to our children components, which would just be button.jsx and storeitem.jsx. So let's do exactly that. In our app.jsx file, we need to have a piece of state that watches for the button to be clicked. That way we can know when to display the store item. So to do this, let's actually go up here in our app. Let's make a new piece of state. I'm going to write const, we'll do show item, and then set show item like this. And then we're going to set equal to use state. And then by default, it should be equal to false, just like it is in our button. And this is basically the exact same piece of state we actually have in our button component here, except here we're just moving up to the parent component. So we're just shifting the functionality up from the child component to the parent component. Let's do a little something here now. So we're going to keep track of whether the button is showing or not within the parent component, which is just this app.jsx file. So now let's go ahead and go into our button component here. And let's go ahead and delete this piece of state because we won't actually be needing it anymore. And then what we can do is pass down the show item and set show item into our button. So if I actually go into our app here for our button, let's make a show prop, and we're going to pass in show item. And then let's also make a set show prop, which will just be set show item, just like that. So instead of keeping track of the state within our button component, we're keeping track of it here in app.jsx. And then if we want to access or modify that state in our button component, we can use these props here that we're passing down to actually access it. So to do that, let's go into our button component and let's add in our two new props up here. So in addition to having color, let's just add two new props. And you want to make sure they match the name exactly. So we have show and we have set show. So we'll do just that. We'll say show, set show, and then color like this. And we conveniently name the props show and set show. That way they could still be running this code in the JSX because we're still calling a set show function and a show function. The difference is now these props are just coming from the parent component here. The very last thing we need to do in order to get this code to work is to add our conditional statement to display the item. Just like we did with our button, we need to write a conditional statement to display the store item if the button is clicked. So if show item is true, we should show store item. If show item is false, we should not show store item. So we'll do the same ternary operator we use for button. So let's actually go below our button here. Let's go ahead and just make curly brackets so it knows we're doing JavaScript. And then we're going to do a ternary operator. So we're going to say if show item is equal to true, then what do we want to do? Then we want to make a store item component. And then here, just like before, we want to pass in an actual item here. So let's just pass in item 1 for right now. Because we're passing in item 1, let me just go ahead and get rid of item 2 and item 3 here, clear up some space. So basically what this is saying here is if show item is true, we want to render a store item component that is passing in item 1. And then we want to make the condition for if it's false. So we'll say if it's false. And then for now, let's just render in absolutely nothing. So we'll just do an empty tag just like this. And that red little error we're having should go away. And now we should have a working conditional statement that uses a button to communicate with this sibling component store item and displays it if the button is clicked. So just so we're clear, we have this piece of state up here that says show item and set show item. And we're passing these down into our button component. And then inside of our button here, we can basically change the prop that we just passed down. So every time it is clicked, we're changing the prop to be the opposite of what it currently is. So if it is true, it'll be turned to false. If it is false, it'll be turned to true. And then right below that, inside this app.jsx, we're checking that. We're saying, okay, if show item is true, we want to display a store item. If it's false, we just want to display nothing. If we just go ahead and Control S this file, and then Control S this file and save it, and then we just refresh this page here, we can now see it in action. So when I click it for the first time, it now displays the store item, which is just item 1 for us. It's this item here that has metal bat for baseball with the price of 50. And then if we were to click hide item, it would go away. And then if we click it again, it goes back to show item here, shows the item, hide item, and we can keep going back and forth as many times as we want. And this behavior would just keep switching back and forth. So now we have a functional button that displays some other component every single time it is clicked. And this is actually the exact same logic that you use for something like a drop-down menu, for instance. Imagine you have, for instance, in the top right of your screen, like a picture for your profile and your settings or whatever. Whenever you click it, you want to have a drop-down menu that gives you some options, like go into your settings or go to your user profile or just click log out. So the idea is that if you click that, it'll register a drop-down menu, which is basically this exact same logic. Obviously, the component would be a little bit different, but the idea is the exact same. We would need to have some Boolean value to check if it's open or not, and then if it is, we want to render something. If it's not, we can just render nothing. Now that we have working code here, we can actually make a very quick improvement to the code we already have. The ternary operator with the question mark and colon that we have here works completely fine, but there's actually a more succinct way to write it using React-specific notation. It avoids having to specify an empty div tag, and just looks a bit cleaner overall, in my opinion. So instead of using the ternary operator, we can actually just replace this question mark here with a double ampersand, or the and symbols I like to call it. And then after doing that, we can just delete everything after this colon here. So we just go ahead and just delete this like that. And then if we were to go ahead and save it, the code works the exact same as it did before, but we've just written a little less code. And we also don't need to actually write show item equals true like this, because if we just write show item by itself and it's a Boolean, it'll know what we mean when the page runs. So I can actually just delete this equals true, and again, just save it, and then the code would run exactly the same as before. And now we're doing the exact same thing we were just doing a moment ago, but with about half the code in a single line. We made it a lot more succinct, and it looks quite a bit better, which just makes it a little bit nicer to read. So basically all this notation is doing with React is if this value is true here, whatever is in the left-hand side of the ampersand symbols, then we display whatever is on the right-hand side of the ampersand symbols, otherwise just display nothing. This is almost always the way that I choose to do conditional rendering with React. It's easy to remember just doing a double and symbol, and it's shorter than the writing the ternary operator altogether, so I find it to be quite nice. Let's quickly summarize everything that's happening in this program in case you got lost anywhere along the way. So inside of our app.js component, which we're already in, we're defining a piece of state here called show item, and we have a setter function called set show item. And then we are setting it to false by default. And then we are taking this state that we made here, and then we are passing it down into our button component, and we're just calling the props show and set show. That way, if we go to our button component, we can just call show right here and set show right here. And it will modify the state of its parent component, which is app.jsx. And then after that, all we're doing is writing a conditional statement down here to check whether or not show is true or false, or whether show item, is true or false. If it's true, we display store item, and then if it's not, we don't display anything. Hopefully that line of reasoning makes sense. If it doesn't, you can go back in the video and rewatch certain parts, or leave a comment and I can try and clarify this for you. One last thing before we wrap up here. Like I just said, this is typically always the way I do conditional rendering with React. However, I know that some people don't like having to write inline code inside JSX, and would rather just write an if-else statement somewhere else to handle the conditional rendering. And I'll show you how to do that real quick if that's kind of the route that you want to take. So let's go up here. Let's make a new function. Let's just say function, we'll call it handle show for right now. And actually, I'm going to capitalize the H here because I'm actually going to make this a component itself. So let's just give it a prop for right now. Let's call it show like this. And then we'll do our curly brackets like this. So we're actually writing a component inside of a component here. And then inside of this, all we need to do is write an if-else statement. So I can write if show, meaning if show is true, then all I want to do is return some JSX because this is a component, and I'll return store item where we're passing in item is equal to, item 1 like this. So this line here saying if show is true, return store item is literally the exact same code that we're doing down here, but this is just showing you putting the functionality inside of its own separate function instead of writing it inside of the JSX itself. Then all we need to do to access this functionality would be to delete our current conditional statement here that we're doing. And then all we would need to do, and actually we don't need color brackets here because we're doing a component instead of just JavaScript code. We just need to type handle show like this. And then we'll need to pass in the show prop that we have up here because we have a prop that we defined. So let's pass in a show prop, and let's just set it equal to our show item piece of state. So we'll just go ahead and pass that in. Now, if we go ahead and save this page, the button again works the exact same as before. So all I've basically done now is given you a second way to do conditional rendering by using your own function component to handle the conditional rendering, instead of writing it in line with JSX by using the ternary operator or by using the double and symbol operator. And again, I prefer doing it inline using the double and operator I showed you a moment ago, but if you prefer this method and like writing it kind of out in your own function, then by all means, go for it. And with that, we'll officially wrap up this video. In this video, you learned how to render out lists in React in order to display multiple pieces of information. You also learn how to render certain components or pieces of data based on a condition, which is known as conditional rendering. In the very next episode, we'll go over React Router, which allows you to build apps that are multiple pages and allows you to navigate between each page. I will see you in the next one.